I should start off with several thank yous. So I should start by thanking the EPS for this award. I think the EPS, I presume we're all in agreement, they are a good organisation. They are a force for good in academia. I think they do an outstanding job of redistributing the wealth and giving a lot back to support ECRs. They're doing the right things, and so I'm particularly delighted to be here talking at an EPS meeting once again. Thanks also to Rob for his kind words of introduction. So Rob, I mentioned to him last night over drinks that when I started at Cardiff 20 years ago, almost to the day. It was probably about today. And Rob was assigned as my mentor when I got there. I mentioned this to him last night. Of course, true to form, Rob denied all knowledge of this. But during that time, nevertheless, he gave me all sorts of very, very useful pieces of advice for how to deal with teaching and how to deal with research that have stayed with me to this day. So I really do appreciate that. Tom as well, thanks very much for organising the symposium today. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. I absolutely loved it. And a very nice mix of old friends and new friends and hopefully future friends. So that was really great. So I am going to start off. This meeting is an interesting financial confluence for me. So I'm going to start off by basically inviting identity theft by showing you my bank statement. So I moved to Australia in 2011, so about 13 years ago. And, but I kept my UK bank account open for some reason. Well, I kept it open because there are 2 transactions that go through that account every year. That's all that happens. So this is the entire bank statement. And this meeting is a very interesting, it's at the confluence of those transactions. So one of them, now before I reveal this line, I should say I prepared this slide about 2 weeks ago, and that will become obvious why that's important in a moment for those of you who were at the AGM earlier on. So one of them is my subs for the EPS. And as we were informed in the AGM earlier on, that's actually gone up to £30 now and went up several years ago. So please do rest assured that I will update my standing order and pay the arrears before I go to bed tonight. So one of them is my EPS subs. The other one is the royalties that I receive for this book that I edited with Chris Mitchell back in 2010 on attention and associative learning, which is basically the subject of this talk. These 2 transactions are very, very focal today. Now, yeah, this is not financially sustainable. Especially now this has gone up to £30. So please, I know it's a little old, but you know, help a man out. So anyway, that's that book. So that book was published with Chris Mitchell, I say, who unfortunately wasn't able to be here today. Chris is the most delightful chap in the world. I think many of you will know him, and he's such a lovely guy. And in the course of putting this book together, we had lots of arguments about how we learn. Chris and I have very different views on that subject. And, but I really, really like Chris, and so I didn't really want to argue with him. And I think maybe subconsciously, that was around the time we were putting this book together that my sort of research direction started to move away from those questions of how we learn, and instead look a bit more at what effect does learning have on us. Rather than the mechanisms of learning, instead studying the impacts of learning. So how does learning, however it happens, influence other aspects of information processing and behaviour? And Chris and I saw more eye to eye on that, so that made me very happy. And so that's the subject I'm going to be talking about today. I should also say there's going to be a contrast with, so Daniel's talk yesterday was masterful, I thought, and thoughtful and creative and rigorous. This will not be like that. So this is going to be lurching from very, very specific data to sort of wildly overgeneral claims and back again. But I hope you'll tolerate it. So it's, again, staying with the book. So the other thing to say about this talk is it's kind of going to be something of a voyage of rediscovery. So this question of how learning and attention interact has been around in the animal conditioning, associative learning literature for a long time, and most of that book was focused on theories of that relationship that derive from the conditioning literature. These are kind of the two big ones, I suppose. Nick McIntosh's model from 1975 and John Pearce and Jeff Hall's somewhat later paper in 1980. John's here today, so it's absolutely fantastic. I'm delighted to see him here. And all of these three wonderful chaps contributed chapters to the book as well, so we were absolutely delighted that they were able to do that. And I think, yeah, the more I go, the more I go through the work I'm doing these days, I think I'm just coming back to exactly these sorts of theories. And so we're going to end up basically where we started. We're going to rediscover those theories, but hopefully we'll have learned something slightly new along the way. So, what's attention? We're in the supermarket and we're going shopping. How do we go shopping? One way that we could go shopping would be to look at every item on the shelf in the supermarket in turn and weigh up the pros and cons of that item, move on to the next one and the next one and the next one and the next one. That's not a good way to go shopping. It would take you a very, very long time to do that. So we need to narrow down our options. And that's what attention does, right? Attention is the cognitive process of prioritizing some sources of information or stimuli or tasks and filtering out others. So we're in the supermarket and let's say we want to buy some broccoli. So what I can do is I can use goal-directed, top-down, endogenous, strategic controlled, use your favorite term here, attentional control to do things that I know are going to take me in the direction of broccoli. I can go to the fruit and veg section of the supermarket. I can look for green things, for example. I can prioritize those things, kind of try and filter out everything else. And that will be a pretty good way of ending me up with my broccoli. But while I'm walking around the supermarket, perhaps I walk past this sign, which is bright and distinctive and advertising sponges, as it turns out. I don't want to buy sponges, and yet this sign might nevertheless grab my attention by virtue of its distinctiveness against the background. It's particularly bright, it's large, it's colourful. And so it might capture my attention in an involuntary, bottom-up, exogenous kind of way. And people have been, this is not a new idea, right? These ideas have been around in the attention literature for a long time and are widely sort of accepted, I would argue. And that's great. And so, the suggestion is that these two types of influence might converge on some integrated attentional priority map that sort of, they might compete with one another, they might support one another in marking out the locations or the stimuli to which I should attend and the ones that I should ignore. Great. But then in more recent times, a sort of a third way has come about. And there were lots of articles written about it. Well, there's certainly been an awful lot over the years, over recent years. But one of the more notable early articles in this area was this one written by O and colleagues, which described this goals versus physical salience idea as a failed theoretical dichotomy. That's strong language. And the crux of their paper was that this doesn't go far enough, and they referred to a sort of a burgeoning area of research that's now become enormous, demonstrating that attentional priority is also shaped by our previous experience, our previous learning about stimuli, in a way that is not captured by thinking about current goals and thinking about physical salience. And they labeled this influence selection history. And so the rest of this talk really is going to be about selection history and its implications for information processing and behavior. So coming back to our supermarket, we're walking around looking for broccoli. Maybe this has grabbed our attention, but we've walked on a bit further. And then we might walk along this aisle and we might notice up here there's a little box of drinking chocolate. And perhaps the drinking chocolate captures our attention. And it might capture our attention by virtue of its association with rewarding consequences, right? The particularly very carefully Cadbury purple colour might have become associated through lots of experience of eating delicious chocolate in the past with a rewarding outcome. And that alone might be enough to help this stimulus capture our attention, even though it's not our goal, we're looking for broccoli, and it's not particularly physically salient, it doesn't really stand out among its background. But by virtue of its our previous experience with it, perhaps it will start to capture our attention. That's the idea of most of this talk in a nutshell. So how can we show that, test that idea in the lab? And we can do that using, so we're using an additional singleton procedure that Helene very helpfully talked about earlier on. So in this task, it's an incredibly simple task. So we're using, it's an eye tracking task. It's a gaze contingent eye tracking task. So on every trial, our participants are going to see a bunch of circles and a diamond. And all the participants have to do is look at the diamond as quickly as they can and as directly as they can. That's the entire task. It's incredibly boring. But in this, and they're told if you look at the diamond, you'll get a reward. In this display, though, we have a salient color singleton distractor. So one of the non-target items is colored, and the color of that distractor item signals the amount of reward that's going to be available for looking at the diamond. But the kicker here is if you look at that distractor, you lose the reward. Okay? So it's going to tell you how big the reward's going to be, but don't look at it, whatever you do. And so we have two different colors. Let's say for this participant, a red distractor signals the availability of high reward, 500 points, and we're going to turn points into money at the end of the experiment, so it will determine your payoff. And a blue distractor signals the availability of a low reward, 10 points in this case. Obviously, we counterbalance all the color reward assignments. So for half of participants, the blue distractor's the high reward one and vice versa. For the rest of this talk, I'm just going to pretend the red one's always the high reward one. But this isn't just that people pay more attention to red things or whatever. So if you're a sensible participant in this task, what do you do? Well, what you do is you ignore color completely. There's no point in ever looking at color. You're going to lose the reward if you do so. So you should just go to the target as quickly as you can, totally suppress color if you can. What you really shouldn't do is look at the high reward distractor, because doing that loses you a large reward. Looking at the blue one doesn't really matter so much. But the interesting finding here is that as people go through this task, they start to look more and more at the high reward distractor and less at the low reward distractor. So they're doing exactly the wrong thing here. This is detrimental to their payout at the end of the task. So our participants are more likely to look at the high value distractor, therefore meaning that they lose more of the high value rewards, the rewards that matter. It's a stupid thing to do. Why are they doing this? They're fools. And the implication is that the high value distractor has become more likely to capture participants' attention, presumably in a fairly involuntary way, right? So by virtue of its status as a signal of a relatively large reward, we never tell participants the exchange rate between points and money until the end of the experiment. It's not really a signal of a large reward at all. But by virtue of its status as a signal of a relatively high reward, it becomes more likely to capture their attention, even though that pattern is counterproductive. And so we can kind of consider our model of attentional control that I talked about before, our kind of tripartite model. So in this task, participants' goal is to look at the target, not at the distractor. So prioritization of the distractor is presumably not about their current goals. It's also not a result of physical salience. So it is a salient distractor, and it would capture attention by virtue of its status as a physically salient thing. But the difference between the low reward and the high reward one, we ensure that those stimuli have the same physical salience, or we equate it by counterbalancing them, right? So it's not just that something's more, that the high reward one is more physically salient than the other. So it's not about its physical salience. So, this is demonstrating, or I would argue showing, that attentional priority can indeed be shaped by selection history, by learning about reward. Now, we're not the only people to have done this, right? Lots and lots of other studies in lots and lots of ways have shown similar kinds of patterns. I think this is a kind of interest. I like this procedure for doing it, but there are lots of other ways to do it as well. incredibly reliable effect. It works every time you do it. This is Daniel Pearson. He's a former PhD student where he was a research assistant, and then he became a PhD student, and then a postdoc, and now he's working at the University of Sydney. He's got a lectureship there. Fantastic student, and he did lots of this work. So what have we seen so far? Okay, attention is a function of reward value in this task, but looking at the distractors is never rewarded, which is bizarre. And we call this effect value modulated attentional capture, or VMAC for short, for fairly obvious reasons. So another thing that Daniel's shown is that this effect operates very, very rapidly. So what you can do is look at the attentional bias as a function of saccade latency. So what you can do is when the display appears, you can measure the length of time from the display appearing to people making their first eye movement away from fixation. And you can look at the direction in which that eye movement goes, and you can look at whether it goes towards the distractor or not. And so what we can do here is look at the proportion of saccades going towards the distractor as a function of the latency of those saccades. And what you see is that this bias towards going towards the high reward distractor versus the low reward one is most pronounced for the very, very fastest eye movements that people make, within 170 milliseconds there. It's an incredibly rapid effect, which suggests something sort of fairly fundamental, early, I would argue, is going on the attentional priority map. So that's fun. And so coming back to a sort of more conditioning type perspective, this is a Pavlovian reward cue, right? It's a signal of reward. It's not the thing that you need to, it's not the target that you need to respond to in order to earn that reward. It's a signal of the availability of something. As I've laboured many times, the reward cue isn't the target of search. And this phenomenon of paying attention to a signal of reward rather than sort of the goal, the target that you ought to go to get that reward, is very reminiscent of a pattern of behaviour that's been talked about in animal studies for many, many years, called sign tracking, which is the idea that animals track the sign of reward. They track the signal that reward cues can come to exert control over attention, orienting, and behaviour. So here's a nice example of that. This is I'll show you a video by Dale Swartzentruber. So what's going to happen is there's a pigeon in a box here, and a light will appear for 5 seconds over there, and at the end of that light, when the light terminates, a little light will turn on down here, and the pigeons some food will be delivered in that little hopper down there. So you can think, well, what do you do if you're the pigeon? If you're a sensible pigeon, what you do is just stand here. You might look at the light, you might not even bother. You might even just stick your head in the food hopper and leave it there, because there's nothing you can do to control whether the food turns up or not. But here's what the pigeon actually does. So here's our little pigeon. The light's going to go on in a sec. There it is. The pigeon runs over, furiously starts pecking the light. And of course the light goes off, and during that time it's walking back and forth, it's losing access to the grain that it could otherwise have received. Light comes on, run! Pecking the light does absolutely nothing at all, but this signal of reward has come to capture the pigeon's attention and consequently change its behaviour. And people have talked about this as an attribution of incentive salience. So that's other terminology that I'll be using a lot in this talk. The idea that stimuli take on salience due to the incentive value that's attached to them, the potential they have to give me reward. Now, why does this matter? What's the deeper implication here? And the deeper implication is that attention, kind of coming back to the supermarket example from earlier on, attention is shaping how we gather information from the world. And how we gather information from the world, the information we encode, is going to determine how we interact with the world, how our overt behaviour plays out, and how we make decisions. So this is an article we wrote about this idea a few years ago, Daniel and Poppy and Lucy, who will come up again later in the talk, so I won't show pictures of them here. Yeah, and so people have put forward mathematical formal models of the impact of attention on decision making in these sort of sequential sampling models, so drift diffusion models. Kreibich in particular has talked about the attentional drift diffusion model, which is, as I say, one of these sequential sampling models, and the key sort of innovation in that model is the idea that attention modulates the rate of evidence accumulation. So if you're paying attention to an option, you're accumulating evidence about it faster, therefore it's going to weigh more heavily in any subsequent decision that you make. And so that's great, but those models often just don't really think about where attention comes from. Why would you pay more attention to some options than others? And so what we've suggested is that these kinds of attentional biases, in particular value-modulated attentional biases, might be operating here in concert with that kind of attentional drift diffusion model to influence choice. So, you imagine our supermarket example. We've got this person who is wanting to buy something healthy to eat, a banana, and there's a bunch of cupcakes in the display. And maybe the cupcakes initially grab this person's attention by virtue of their reward history. They taste delicious. And this person sort of starts accumulating evidence in favor of one or either option. And so while they're paying more attention to the cupcake, they're accumulating evidence in support of the cupcake faster. So if we forced them to choose at this point, we said, right, make your decision now. Well, they'll look at which one have I got more evidence for being a good choice? Cupcakes, okay, that's what I'll have. Maybe after a while, these kind of goal-directed processes kick in, and perhaps eventually the banana takes over. But everything up to this point in the decision-making sort of cascade, they're going to choose the cupcake. So the suggestion is that these sorts of value-modulated, very, very rapid, very fundamental, very automatic value-modulated attentional biases might actually kind of start doing some choice for us, or they're kind of nudging our choice machinery before we even start making a choice. So it comes down to what is a decision? Decisions are being made for us before we even start making decisions, if that makes sense. So prior learning skews the machinery of choice. Now, it's a nice idea. There's actually very few experiments that have looked at that. Most studies in this area kind of stop at the point of demonstrating differences in attention and don't really go on to look at impacts on evidence accumulation. We haven't done much. We've just started work in this area. So I'm going to tell you about, this is a very, very new experiment. This is only probably about a month old. This is Nick Weich. I didn't have a good photo of him. He has his eyes closed. But I'm going to get a better one. But that will have to do for now. So he's a postdoc who's just started working in the lab. He used a random dot motion procedure. We saw a few of those yesterday. So this is slightly different in that you're going to see two sets of dots that are moving. They're not all moving, they're broadly coherent, right? And the two sets of dots are moving in slightly different directions. And your task as a participant is to judge the average motion direction of the two. So there'll be some grey ones and there'll be some blue ones, but your job is to work out the average motion direction of the two. It's not easy. So there's the dots. I don't know, maybe you can see the average motion direction, maybe you can't. I'll help you out by putting some lines on it. The blue ones are going down the blue line and the grey ones are going down the grey line. So the correct answer would be there in this case. So that's what people did in this task. They did that over and over again. It was much harder for them than it was for you because we only showed those dots for a very short period of time, and the coherence of the motion was lower than what you saw as well. So actually, this is a little video of what the participant would look like. It was much shorter than that as well. I've extended it there. So they'd see the dot display, move a little arrow to say what the average direction was, and then they'd get some reward points, again, going to be converted into money, et cetera, et cetera. And the number of points they could earn was determined by how close they were to the correct answer. So the closer you were, the more points, more money you got. But the key part, again, is we manipulated reward in this task. So let's suppose, for a given participant, again, all counterbalance, let's suppose when there's blue dots in the display, there's going to be a low reward available. So for that kind of response, you get 8 points. When there's red dots in the display, for a response of the same accuracy, you get 10 times the number of points, or maybe it was 100 times, I can't remember. But you multiplied your earnings. So you could earn far more on the high reward trials than the low reward trials. And we're interested in people's accuracy of responding in this task. So these are the data. So what I'm showing you here is this is the distribution of people's responses, and the orangey red line is the median of their responses. And so in this figure, the way to read it is that we've realigned all the trials so that 0 degrees here is the correct answer. That's the actual average. And we've positioned, in realigning all these trials, we've positioned it so that the target is always clockwise from that. So any bias clockwise represents a bias towards the colour rather than the grey. And so what we can see on these low reward trials is people are very, very accurate on average at these tasks. Obviously there's some slop, but they're generally pretty good at it. The key part, now this is going to be a small effect, set your expectations before I show you the figure, is that in the high reward case, they are significantly biased away from the true response and towards the colour, more biased than they are in the low reward case. So we're seeing again this modulation by reward, in this case on decision making, right, on their response over this longer period of time in this task, the way that they're accumulating information. So the suggestion here is that VMAC is actually shaping decision making, that while the frames of this random dot display are going on, people are kind of extracting more information from the colour, from the high reward colour, than they are from the low reward colour, and that's actually biasing their performance and making them incorrect again. It's actually pushing them away from the truth because they're kind of sucking too much information out. So that they've accumulated more evidence from the high reward related stimulus than they should have done. And as a result, it's biased their decision making. There's a few other studies that have looked at kind of similar ideas that I've cited down there. So that's nice. That was the very specific data part. Now we're lurching towards the wild overgeneralization. So why does this have any, why do we care about this, and how does this relate to kind of theories of behavior more generally? Well, a sort of classic view in motivated behavior is this distinction that people make between goal-directed actions and stimulus response habits. So to illustrate the idea, let's suppose it's after Christmas, we've overindulged a little, and so we're trying to eat healthily. We're trying to eat salads and fruit and all that sort of thing. And so we're trying to do that in a goal-directed way, right? That's what we know we ought to do. But there's some Christmas detritus left over. And so a view, the classic view that distinguishes between goal-directed actions and stimulus response habits might suggest that what might happen is that the stimulus here, the perception of this Quality Street tin, by virtue of lots of prior reinforcement, lots of experiences in the past of eating Quality Street and having a lovely old time, that by virtue of that prior history of reinforcement, we might have formed a stimulus response association, and so the perception of the stimulus might elicit that habitual SR habit, this sort of fixed automatic response or an action sequence that basically we see the tin, and that elicits the automatic response of eating sweets. And the key concept here is that this behavior, this habitual behavior, is not mediated by a representation of the outcome. It's become divorced from the outcome. You're not thinking about the outcome anymore. Effectively, you see the Quality Street tin. This is a very overbroad characterization. And you become mindless. You become a zombie until your mouth is filled with toffee pennies or something, and then you look around and work out what was going on. Yeah, that's one classical view of the sort of distinctions that we see in motivated behavior. But in recent years, people have started to question that account on various grounds. So one is that some of the evidence that's been used to support it, in humans in particular, is not always as rock solid as one might hope. They started to question, though, at a more sort of almost philosophical level, whether this so-called habitual behavior really reflects a loss of choice. Is it about a loss of control, where we kind of cede all control to the quality street until we come to with the toffee pennies in our mouths? Because let's think about what actually is involved here. You see this quality street tin, and there might be a relatively complex set of behaviors that are involved in actually getting to the outcome, the rewarding outcome here. You've got to take the lid off the tin. You've got to sort through the horrible strawberry creams so you don't eat any of those. Unwrap the thing, put it in your mouth. That's a long sequence of events. And are we really totally mindless while all that's happening? And I suspect there is insight about the outcome. You imagine yourself being in that situation. Someone taps you on the shoulder halfway through and says, "What are you doing?" You'd probably say, I'm having a sweet. I think a lot of the time you'd know what you're doing. You're doing it even though you know you shouldn't, right? You know you ought to be doing this thing, but this goal has become more attractive for some reason. And this is an idea, again, we're not the first people to say this, but maybe we're the most recent, I don't know. But it's an idea we've kind of pushed in this recent article. This is Poppy Watson. So Poppy is fabulous. So she came to work with me as a postdoc many years ago, and now has just recently started a lectureship at the University of Technology, Sydney. So she's doing very well. And Reinhard Weers, who's her former PhD supervisor, who works at the University of Amsterdam, and I've collaborated with him quite a lot over the years. Lovely chap. And so we've suggested instead that maybe, not necessarily instead, but maybe an additional way of looking at this, or you could see it as an alternative way, is to think of choice as a biased competition instead. And a biased competition that's modulated by attention. So we can kind of think back to our priority map again, right? We've got our current goals which say we should favour salad. But we've seen already that prior experience can shape the way we pay attention to things in relatively very automatic ways. And so these two stimuli in this case are going to be kind of competing for attention by different routes. Maybe the quality street wins, right? Maybe the excitement of reward is enough that it wins the fight for attention. And as I sort of suggested previously, attention shapes decision making. And so if our quality street wins the battle for attention, maybe that's going to nudge our choice architecture in favour of choosing sweets over choosing salad. And what we've argued is that once an option wins the competition for selection, things are competing here to become the goal of behaviour. And so once the quality street has won out, then what we do is form an action plan to get to the quality street. I've surrendered at this point. I've said, well, I'm going to have sweets. And I then form, in a goal-directed way, in a kind of flexible, maybe strategic way, I form a plan of how I'm going to get to those sweets, how I'm going to get rid of the strawberry creams and so on. So what we've kind of suggested is that attention really here is selecting targets of behaviour rather than actions being selected by the stimulus. We're not mindless. When we've selected the target, maybe we've selected the target in a fairly mindless way, but from that point on, we are behaving, we're making choices, we're planning in a flexible way. So this raises the possibility that the goal-directed nature of action might actually be independent of how or why the target was prioritized. Whether we prioritize sweets because we want them, because I've said, I'm not on a diet, the diet's over, I'd love to have some sweets, or whether we've prioritized them because, well, I really wanted to have salad, but my selection history has pushed me in that direction. It doesn't really matter for the purpose of what we do once we've prioritized them. So sort of labouring that point, goals may be automatically selected. This is a paper by the magnificently named Fiery Cushman. about habitual control of goal selection in humans. And so to illustrate this idea, this is, I'm inviting more identity fraud, right? This is where I live. And on a relatively regular basis, I get on my bike intending to go to the supermarket, which is down there. But I'm not really I'm not really thinking about what I'm doing very much, and I accidentally cycle to work, which is up there. Again, the habit-based view, the kind of classical view of what's happening there is I get on my bike, and the stimulus of being my bike elicits through, because of repetition, elicits an automatic response sequence. So I sort of get on the bike, become zombie, wake up at work. But again, that's a complicated journey. Car drivers in Australia are insane. They all want to run you over. So if I were really doing that in a mindless way, not thinking about where I'm trying to get to, I would be squashed. Likewise, if I come across roadworks here, I'm just going to reroute, right? I could do that in a flexible way. And if someone tapped me on the shoulder halfway through my journey and asked, where are you going? I'd say to work. Oh shit, I was meant to go to the supermarket. So again, it's this idea, I've selected the wrong goal or an inappropriate goal, but I'm working towards that goal in a chosen way. And so we can sort of look at in fact, this is quite related to something that Helene was talking about earlier on, this idea that we can select our selection history works in a quite a persistent way. So this is Jenny Lee, who's a former PhD student, now a clinical psychologist. A QJP paper, Rob. And it's this task again, back to the visual search task. And so we got people, this is basically just a replication of the same thing as I told you before, right? Red is high reward, blue is low reward. We get more attention to red than to blue. Fine, that's not very exciting. What we can do after that, though, is tell people, right, now we're changing the values of these things. Everything's going to have low value now. So we're going to devalue it. We tell people everything about this. They don't have to learn in a trial by trial way. We tell them red things are now just as bad as blue things are. And we look at their performance and it doesn't change over the course of this experiment. I'm sure if you trained forever and ever, it would probably squish down again. But they have absolute knowledge, and we check in all sorts of ways that they know that these things are now worth the same thing, but their attention doesn't change. You can also tell them both things are really good now. Attention doesn't change. So this priority can be very persistent. It's kind of in line with that idea that it's this persistence that influences that might influence goal selection in a very persistent way, an automatic way. I'm going to speed up a bit. Okay, so this idea kind of reaches its zenith in the context of thinking about addiction. So because many addictive drugs provide very potent neural reward signals, and cues associated with drugs, it's been argued that cues associated with drugs can become imbued with incentive salience, right? They're reward cues, just like I've been talking about so far. They become motivational magnets that will elicit craving, a real desire for the drug, and therefore drug seeking. And people have kind of looked at attentional bias to drug cues in the context of addiction for many, many years now. They often use things like the visual probe tasks, right? So you've got an alcohol cue and a neutral cue, and they appear on either side of the screen, and then a probe appears that you've got to respond to, and you find that people are faster to respond to probes that appear in the alcohol location than the neutral location, and that attentional bias is greater in heavy drinkers than light drinkers, that sort of thing. There are acres of those papers that you could read if you wanted to. And that's great, and it's very interesting. There are potential issues to interpretation here, right? So what's going on in this task? Is this actually kind of what we might think of as a sort of automatic selection history, sign tracking type response? Or is it more top down? Is it more that if I really like drinking, I really like alcohol, and so when these things come on, I find the vodka much more interesting than the tea, and so I just choose to look at it. And there's no real disadvantage to doing so here, because the target's equally likely to appear in that location as it is over there. So it doesn't really hurt me or help me, and if I like looking at alcohol, then maybe that's what I'm choosing to do. We can also ask, well, is it actually specific to the drug cues, or is there a more general bias in the cognitive apparatus going on here? So that's what we kind of tried to address that issue. Before I can get to that study, I just need to talk quickly about a different version of the task. So if we're running experiments outside the lab, online and so on, we can't really use eye tracking very well. So we have an RT-based version of the same task, where now your job is to respond to the orientation of the line segment in the diamond, and you'll get points for doing that. The faster you respond, the more points you get, and let's say red things here signal that it's going to be a bonus trial, so you'll get more points on high reward trials than low reward trials. And what we see in healthy participants is that this was so boring, they had to do this task for 3 hours non-stop. And we see that people's responses, the bars here show response time, responses are faster on the, they're slower on the high reward trials than the low reward trials. So again, it's like their attention is being captured by this high reward thing. Again, what you ought to do in this task, ignore color altogether and just respond to the diamond on every trial. But they're slower, and they're also, by the end of the task, they're also less accurate. So the circles here show errors. So they're making more errors, and they're slower on those high reward trials. So it's just an analogy to the eye tracking task I told you about earlier, but we can run it online and things. So this is Poppy again. So she, in a heroic study, tested 57 people who were accessing inpatient alcohol services using that task. And here's the results. So what we found, this is the audit score. So it's a measure of problematic drinking behaviors, alcohol-related behaviors. Scores above, I think 15 here, indicate likely clinical dependence. And the y-axis is showing the difference in RT to high reward minus low reward trials. So larger means more sign tracking, more incentive salience, more attentional bias to reward. And what we see is, again, it's not enormous, but it is a significant positive correlation. I mean, the miracle is that this study was pre-registered. They never work out that well, but all of these data analyses were pre-registered. And we see this significant relationship between people's risky alcohol behaviors and their measure on this kind of totally non-drug related sign tracking measure, right? It's got nothing to do with drugs. It's about small amounts of basic inconsequential amounts of money. It also predicted return to use at 3-month follow-up. So Poppy followed up all these people 3 months later and looked at whether they had started drinking again. And performance on that task predicted return to use. Speaking of heroic studies, here, this is Lucy Albertella, who's a former PhD student, now working at Queensland University of Technology. She just moved. She did this great study. So this is EPS, which is the Dutch version of dry January. And she got a whole load of people to complete that VMAC task, the response time task, before trying to complete the EPS dry January challenge. And then at the end of the month, she got in contact with them all and tried to find out whether they had drunk during that month or whether they'd succeeded in remaining abstinent for the month. She managed to follow up 683 people. And so what we have here is the size of that high reward versus low reward difference as a function of whether people succeeded in the ICPAS challenge or failed. And what we see is that the extent of sign tracking, again measured in this totally non-drug related task at the beginning of the month, predicts whether they're going to succeed or fail. So an increase of 1 standard deviation in VMAX score corresponds to a 27% higher chance of failure in this month. And so again, obviously here the idea is that if you are someone who is particularly susceptible to having your attention captured by these reward-related cues, by cues that have a history of reward, then it's going to be harder for you to remain abstinent because they're going to be keeping on getting this nudge in your choice machinery. And that's going to perhaps make it more likely that you relapse. So attentional bias to non-drug reward is associated with addictive and compulsive behaviors. We've seen individual differences in the reward it suggests that there are individual differences in the reward sensitivity of attention and perhaps, therefore, susceptibility to maintenance and relapse. So we can kind of see addiction as pathological sign tracking, where attention is biasing choice. So, as a consequence, I've Britishized all the references in this talk, apart from this one. This is Victoria Bitter, which is perhaps the most horrible beer in the world. Yeah, so attention is biasing choice. Become more likely to select a drug as a target of behavior. So the idea I've talked about, right? So if you're really sign tracking the signals of this drug, then when I'm just driving past this hotel, this is what's going to leap out at me, and it's going to bias my choice towards drug seeking. And so, again, harping on about this distinction a bit more, a sort of caricature version of it, I guess, is to say under this sort of view of habitual behavior, the person becomes passive. They don't have any control over what they're doing. Their behavior is entirely controlled by the environment. You see the stimulus and it elicits automatically this sequence of responses. You're not thinking about the outcome at all. You have no conception of it. On this sort of biased choice perspective that I'm pushing, the person remains an active choice-making agent throughout, but it's just that their choice-making has been made a bit harder for them. The drugs are, or whatever substance, or the sweets, or whatever you like, is looming larger as a potential option of choice. It becomes like a glowing beacon that's a bit harder to avoid. And it explains why, for example, one of the most consistent findings in the drug literature is that relapse is predicted by craving, how much people report wanting the drug. It's a sort of fundamental finding, but it's not that easy to reconcile with the habitual view, right? Because in the habitual account, drug use is independent of thinking about the outcome. It seems like people are actually focused on desire at the time of use. It's like that's when it's going to loom largest in their choice apparatus. And this also has implications for how we might think about interventions for addiction. It suggests that perhaps we can help by nudging the choice apparatus in a different direction, right? So if sufficiently attractive alternatives are available, then maybe we can make something else better than alcohol or smoking or whatever. So contingency management programs are often used in the context of addiction, and there's very good evidence for their utility. So this is effectively where people are externally rewarded for remaining abstinent. So maybe they do urine analysis once a month, and if it comes back clean, then they get given some money. And so this is Benešek published a meta-analysis of contingency management programs, and they work really well while they're in operation. But as soon as you take the rewards away, well, the choices are now, this isn't as good anymore, right? So people relapse, and they go pretty much back to where they were before. So it's great while it works, and so the idea is obviously that by rewarding these alternative behaviors of abstinence, you're making them more attractive as options and goals for behavior. This is a Reinhard Weir's paper again and colleagues. So what they've done here is introduce this ABC program. So I'm going to try and remember what ABC stands for. ABC stands for identifying antecedents of drug use. So it might be situations in which you might be likely to use. So you get home from work and you're likely to drink a glass of wine, right? You recognize that those are the situations where you might fail in your goal of abstinence. B is behaviors, right? You identify what other behaviors you could potentially do in those circumstances. So maybe I go out for a run instead. And I think the C is consequences. So what you try and do is help people to frame the consequences of why that's a good thing to do, right? You think, well, I'll have more money and I'll be fitter. That's a reward. So the idea is that you're trying to help people to build their own framework for increasing the perceived value of choice alternatives. That might help them in this kind of battle against the environment for their attention. And so Van Dessel and colleagues have published a kind of proof of principle study of that ABC program. It seems to be quite effective, but further work remains to be done. Just something I ought to say, it's a question of choice versus responsibility. So when I'm saying drug use here, the person remains an active choice-making agent. That's not to say that they are therefore, people are entirely responsible for drug use and there's no excuse for it or whatever. I have a choice about whether I go into work every day in principle, but my financial situation, especially you see my bank statement, I need to pay my EPS subs. My financial situation may be such that while I have a choice, I don't really have a choice, right? Likewise, we've seen examples of cases where the environment is having a very, very strong nudging, biasing effect on our choice apparatus, which means some of that choice has been kind of taken out of our hands a bit. So there's a question about choice versus responsibility there. Now, I'm calling this part 2, but it's only going to be 5 minutes, I think. What do we prioritize and why? So why do we do all this, right? So we've seen our attention system automatically prioritize signals of reward, and these are usually important, right? You imagine our caveman past where, there's some blueberries, and blueberries are really tasty, and yellow berries taste horrible. So it would make sense that we would prioritize blue things over yellow things because that's usually a good thing to do, right? We've invented these laboratory tasks where that's not a good thing to do, but that's because we're kind of perverse scientists. But in the real world, it makes a lot of sense to prioritize reward-related things. Maybe less and less so, right? We're living in this kind of reward-saturated environment where there are signals of reward everywhere around us now. And that's an idea I'll come back to later on. But more generally, we can see these kind of patterns through a lens of information seeking, right? Information has value. We want to be able to predict the future. So when I'm coming over to London, I might look at the weather to see how cold it's going to be. That information is useful to me. When I'm working out where I want to go and have a coffee, I might look on Google Maps and get some information there. Right? We want to be able to predict the future because that lets us adapt our behavior and exploit things better. I'll talk about this briefly. This is like a study by Procasi from the 50s. So a simple task, the rat is in this box and it goes up here and it can either go to the left arm or to the right arm, and it'll go into one of these little boxes here and it'll get held there for 30 seconds, and then it'll come through to the chamber at the end and it'll see whether there's some cheese there or not. Not cheese, food pellets. But and if the rat goes to the left-hand chamber, it can't see whether there's cheese there or not, but the colour of the box, let's say half the time the box will be black, and when the box is black, it tells the rat that there's going to be cheese in the future. When the box is white, it tells the rat there's not going to be any cheese. The right-hand one doesn't give any information, right? When I come into this box, I can't see whether there's going to be any cheese or not, and 50% of the time there will and 50% of the time there won't. From the rat's perspective, it doesn't actually make any difference which way it goes. It's going to get 50% cheese whether it goes left or right. But what Procasi found is that the rats were far more likely to go towards this box that provides information, non-instrumental information. It doesn't change whether it gets the cheese or not, but it provides advanced information about what's going to happen next. And that's a useful thing for the rat. You can see the same thing in humans. So this is a task it's too complicated to go into in humans, but there's like a lottery that people, on each trial, and people can sacrifice some of their winnings to find out in advance whether they've won the lottery or not. It's predetermined, so that a rational agent would never pay because you're not changing the outcome of the lottery. You only end up getting less money by paying to see the answer, but people nevertheless do, right? So people place an awful lot of value on information, on advanced information. And so, Friston's kind of suggested that effectively that information is the central unifying principle in brain function. Jackie Gottlieb's also talked about this a lot, talking about this as the primary drive in attention, right? As priority, as a cognitive state that implements information gathering policies. And so I've talked about VMAC and attention to reward, and we can kind of see that pattern of prioritizing stimuli that provide information about upcoming reward, right? We're prioritizing things that tell us something useful about the world, that give us some useful information about a nice thing that's going to happen next. So we could kind of think of that as attentional exploitation, right? Looking for the good things in the world. But that's not the whole story. So this is work with Kelly and Daniel and Julie and a couple of other people. So imagine we have this other task now, right? Where, let's say a blue distractor, I don't know why we've changed to blue and orange, but we have. A blue distractor is always going to give us 50 points, every trial, very boring. Orange distractor, half the time will give us 0 and half the time will give us 100, unpredictably. So the blue distractor is an informative one, and the orange distractor is non-informative. So on this kind of information-seeking type account, we would expect that the blue distractor, which signals reliably gives us diagnostic information on what happens next, should capture more attention. Obviously, the expected value of these two distractors is the same. But what we find is exactly the opposite, that participants in this task pay more attention to the non-informative distractor than the informative one, which we call uncertainty modulated attentional capture. And it really does seem to be, and it's, again, most pronounced in the fastest saccades and so on. And it really does seem to be about uncertainty, variance, precision, however you want to sort of talk about it. So we can have another version of this task where blue things half the time give us 70, half the time give us 100. Orange things still give us 0 or 100, 50% of the time, right? So that one is worth more now, right? This has a higher expected value, but this has the higher uncertainty associated with it. And what we find is that it's still the high variance one that wins out. The more uncertain distractor is the one that wins out, even though participants can tell you at the end, if you ask them which one's worth more, they say, yeah, the blue one's better. So this is a weird finding. We've seen that VMAC effect where people are prioritizing reward magnitude, but here we're seeing it seems to be trumped by uncertainty. So it seems that priority isn't always based on current information gain, on what this thing, it's not always about that I will prioritize the thing that tells me what's going to happen next. And our hypothesis here is that stimuli are sometimes prioritized because they have the potential to provide information in future. That maybe what's happening here is that people are prioritizing this stimuli in an attempt to learn what they signal, what their actual status is in the world, and try and wring information out of them that you can use in future. Now, that's futile in this task because it's a probabilistic task. There's no way to predict what's going to happen next. But the suggestion is maybe participants are, or their attention system is nevertheless prioritizing in an attempt to resolve current uncertainty and be able to make better predictions in future. And so that's going to rely on prediction error, right? Because if you don't have prediction error, if you don't actually find out what the outcome of the trial is, there's no way to learn anything. And so that's the question. This is the last study I'm going to talk about. So this is Callum Nolan, who was an honours student this year who ran this experiment for his project. And so we just gave participants, they had two types of distractor. We gave them full information at the start. So the orange one is what we're going to call the resolve distractor. So on each trial, they're told you'll get 0 or 100 points, and you'll be told on each trial whether you got 0 or 100 points. So they're going to experience prediction error. They might make a prediction, they might be correct or incorrect. The green distractor also, you're going to get 0 or 100 points 50% of the time. Again, totally random, can't be predicted, but we're not going to tell you what you got. So you're just going to be told you got 0 or 100 points. So it's exactly the same uncertainty associated with both types of distractor, but one lot of uncertainty gets resolved for the resolved one, the other one doesn't. You never resolve the uncertainty. Equal reward uncertainty, but you're only experiencing prediction error over here. And what we find, sure enough, is that the resolved distractor captures more attention there. So it does seem to be prediction error, experience of prediction error does seem to be important in driving attentional priority here. I've gone over time, so I'm going to so resolution of uncertainty, not just identification of sources of uncertainty. So it needs to be learnable uncertainty, or at least the attention system thinks it's learnable uncertainty. The participant has been told it's unpredictable, it's totally random, there's no way of predicting this, and yet it's like their attention system at a sort of automatic level is still trying to learn from this information in a futile way. So different types of information maybe have value for different reasons. We might exploit reliable current information and explore potential future information. And this is why I said with this voyage of rediscovery. That's exactly what these two theories say, but in slightly different language. So there's an interaction going on here that we haven't got to the bottom of yet. So summary of this talk. Learning and attention are intricately linked. And prioritization is changing at a fundamental level as a result of our experience. I hope I've convinced you of that. And we potentially have these competing drives based on different aspects of kind of current information versus future information, exploitation versus exploration. And it's going to be really interesting to see how those play out in priority. And it has an impact on decision-making, motivated behavior, experiences, skewing our choice machinery in ways we may have little control over. This is kind of relevant in the context that we're supposedly living in the attention economy now, right? Costs for manufacturing and distribution and things have fallen to the lowest levels in history. And so corporations our attention is now the most valuable resource for which corporations are competing. leading to claims like, that's this one from this book, just 2.5 seconds of attention supposedly will increase the likelihood that brands are considered for purchase. So we are under assault from reward-related cues because brands only have their value through virtue of learning, right? We've learned to predict that this means chicken and this means burgers or whatever. And so we're living in an increasingly insane world, and this is from a recent article where Ford have patented a system to broadcast billboards into your car while you're driving to advertise material for you. So you would hope, at least at this point, they'll start listening to psychologists and attention researchers in particular to work out why that is insane. And so I'm going to end it there. These are all the people I need to thank. There's lots of people up there from Australia, and look, Tom's down there somewhere looking fantastic in the pub, and Ben, who I work with a lot, and Ian, my PhD supervisor, who again set me on this path and is a wonderful chap and a fantastic researcher. Chris, I've talked about. Jan in the Netherlands, who I work with a lot on this sort of attentional stuff. Lucy and Albertella, Lucy and Reinout, who do lots of the clinical stuff, and Jenny and Sandra, former PhD students who did lots of this as well, and the funders. And thank you very much. Sorry, I've gone a bit over.